CEU Medieval Radio, Past Perfect, the talk show about medieval and early modern culture.
Hello, and welcome to Past Perfect, CEU Medieval Radio's program on everything medieval and early modern. My name is Michał Machalski. I am joined today online by Professor Jonathan Harris. He's a historian of Byzantine Empire who teaches history at Royal Holloway, University of London. He's the author of many publications, handbooks, and monographs, and of which probably the most famous is The Lost World of Byzantium from 2015. He's also a debuting novelist. His historical novel Theosis, published this autumn by Trivent, is set during the long reigns of Byzantine Emperor Basil II, about whom we will talk. Jonathan, it's a pleasure to have you here.
I'm very pleased to be here, Michał, on CEU Radio.
I want to start with a general question. Who is Basil II, and why is he so frequently depicted as the emblem of Byzantine success in the Middle Ages?
Well, we're talking here the second half of the 10th century and the first quarter of the 11th century, which in many ways is a rather uncharacteristic period in the history of what is known as Byzantium or the Byzantine Empire or the Eastern Roman Empire, whichever term you prefer. This is a period where the empire actually goes on to the offensive and starts to reconquer some of the lands it had lost. Because when you look at Byzantium, it seems to be a history of it gradually getting smaller and smaller and smaller as the centuries go by. I mean, it starts off as the eastern half of the Roman Empire, and it's got Constantinople and the Balkans and Egypt and Syria, and gradually all these territories drop away, and it's left really with pretty much Constantinople, Greece and the Balkans. And then in the mid-10th century, something happens. The Abbasid Caliph of Islam goes into decline, and the Byzantines take advantage of this to expand to the east, into Syria and Armenia, and in the west as well. They reconquer Bulgaria, taking their frontier up to the Danube. So it is quite an unusual period of Byzantine history.
And Basil is the one leading a lot of those military successes, isn't he?
Later on he is, but to start with, it's a series of generals out on the frontier. The emperor himself just sits in Constantinople, and these generals do the fighting, and they're from certain families, the Koukouas family, the Phocas family, Skleros family. And of course, it's only a matter of time before one member of these families starts to think, well, actually, why aren't I emperor? I'm the guy leading the armies. And they get a marvelous chance, of course, because Basil II's father, Romanus II, dies quite young. And there's Basil II, he's only 5, but he's emperor. And that's the moment when this famous general, Nikephoros Phocas, marches on Constantinople and takes over. He doesn't dispose of little Basil. He just says, well, I'm going to be senior emperor, and the child will be emperor alongside me. So they issue coins with both emperors on. And to make it legitimate, he marries Basil's mother, Theophano. So that's really, you've got really two kind of sources of power. You've got the legitimate Macedonian dynasty who've got power by right of succession, but then you've got these generals who basically have power by the fact they control the armies. And in due course, Nikephoros is replaced by John Tzimiskes, same arrangement, soldier ruling alongside the legitimate emperor Basil II.
And yet, Basil is able to get himself out of the situation as he grows up. He disposes of both Phocas and Tzimiskes.
Well, indeed. I mean, you would have thought that the most likely future for little Basil II was to turn really into some kind of useless rogue who would sit around in the palace while the real emperor, the soldier emperor, would go off and do the fighting. And that's how he'd live his life. And in fact, that's how his younger brother Constantine does live his life. But Basil, for reasons we're not entirely sure about, when he's in his early 20s, he suddenly asserts himself. He disposes of his mentor, Chamberlain Basil Lecapenus, and then he takes on the military disposes of the general who's trying to become emperor, and then amazingly starts leading the armies himself with the same success. He's the first emperor for generations to lead the army. And he does. It's he who conquers Bulgaria. It's he who fights the Fatimids in Syria and beats them. It's he who incorporates a large proportion of Armenia into the Byzantine Empire. So it's really somebody who'd been pretty written off politically, suddenly emerging from nowhere and becoming this colossus who rules for 50 years and hugely expands the empire's borders.
Is it exactly this kind of vigorous personal involvement, especially in military campaigns, which end up being successful, that contrasts itself very nicely with traditional view of Byzantine emperors as pretty passive figures involved in courtly intrigues in Constantinople, that creates this myth or legend of Basil as extremely capable emperor who by the sheer tenacity is able to turn the supposed decline, or at least a marasm, of the empire to rebuild its status within the region, only to have those achievements squandered by successors who return to the more passive politics.
I think you're absolutely right, because later observers absolutely love Basil II. Very often they're historians writing within a set of quite nationalist values and also quite militaristic values. So therefore, Basil is a good thing. He wins battles. He's out there on the frontiers. He's nothing like, as you say, the traditional view of Byzantium as this place dominated by scheming empresses and eunuchs. So they love, and as you say, they see this as the high point of the Byzantine Empire. There's a trilogy of books by compatriot John Julius Norwich, A History of Byzantium, and he calls this the apogee of Byzantium, the high point, the absolute apex. It can't get better than this. And he actually says in the book, Basil II dies on the 15th of December, 1025. On the 16th of December, the decline begins, and it's downhill all the way from the moment Basil II goes. Nobody can fill the big man's shoes because this guy is so great.
Right, that's 19th century and 20th century historiographical assessment. But how true is it? Is it a fair assessment?
Well, like all these things, it's all in the eye of the beholder. It's your interpretation of history. But certainly late 20th century, early 21st century, a lot of people have started to pick holes in that. One of them is Paul Stevenson, who wrote a book called The Legend of Basil the Bulgar Slayer, who notes that there's the sources for Basil II's reign are relatively slim. We don't actually have much contemporary evidence for it. You would have thought if this man was so great, he'd be generating chronicles and songs and everyone celebrating him, but it's relatively little. Most of what we have about Basil's reign was written quite a long time afterwards. It's only in the 12th century that he gets this epithet in Greek, vulgaroktonos, meaning the killer of the Bulgars, the slayer of the Bulgars. And Stevenson suggests that a lot of Basil's reputation is invented later on when the Byzantine Empire is struggling to keep hold of Bulgaria. He kind of looks back to this earlier figure. Another historian who has picked holes is Michael Angold. And he says, well, it's all very well with Basil II, but he handed his successors a poisoned chalice. He left them a very difficult legacy. It's very easy to say these guys messed it all up. But, says Angold, surely you could say that Basil overextended the empire. Because by annexing Bulgaria and Armenia, he robs the empire of its buffer states, which has stood between it and more fearsome enemies. So Armenia had stood between Byzantium and the Seljuk Turks. Bulgaria had stood between Byzantium and a Turkic tribe known as the Pechenegs. And during the 11th century, the Byzantines have to confront these enemies without great success. So you could say that Basil, made a mistake. He should have kept the empire in its natural borders, which are the Balkan Mountains in the west and the Taurus Mountains in the east. So these are some of the ways people have picked holes in that picture of Basil's reign as being the height of perfection.
Right. I find it very interesting that what you already mentioned, that Basil, for all of his successes, was not known as the patron of historiography. We have little contemporary records of the man and his deeds, and what we have is written way after his death. So, can you tell us more about those sources and how do the agenda of those later writers impact our vision of Basil?
Yes, I mean, most of the narratives of Basil's reign are based on a man called John Scyllizes. But Scyllizes was writing around the year 1100. He wasn't alive during Basil II's reign. He's synthesizing information he's got from elsewhere. Now, it's true, we know that a biography of Basil was written by the Bishop of Side, but it hasn't survived. It hasn't come down to us. So, to some extent, this is the accident of history. But when you read Scyllizes, it's quite clear that wherever he's getting his information from, he doesn't have that much information. And some of the information is rather dubious. For example, there's the famous story that Basil, after the Battle of Clydion in 1014, he captured thousands of Bulgars, 22,000 Bulgars, and he decides to have them all blinded. Except he doesn't blind them all. What he does is he blinds 9 out of every 10, but for the 10th man, he'd only have one eye removed. And so the idea was that this one man would then lead the other 9 back to Bulgaria, which they do. So all these poor 22,000 blind Bulgars or half-blind Bulgars come back. They arrive in Bulgaria. The Tsar of Bulgaria, Samuel, takes one look and immediately suffers a heart attack and drops dead. Now, the story is very dubious. 22,000 is an awfully large number of people in medieval terms. And even Scyllizes is slightly dubious about it. He says, osphasi, as they say. He's passing on a kind of anecdote here. And secondly, Tsar Samuel didn't die immediately after the Battle of Clydion. He didn't die until, many, many months later, back in the autumn. The battle was in the summer. Samuel dies in the autumn. So it's Scyllizes is obviously slightly unreliable. We do have some other sources. We have a very nice little biography of Basil written by Michael Psellos, who was writing in the 1070s. But as Psellos himself says, he was only a toddler at the very end of Basil's reign, so he never even saw him. So he's again taking information from elsewhere. What we're lacking is contemporaries. There's one contemporary, a man called Leo the Deacon, who was alive in Basil II's reign and does tell us a little bit about some incidents. But for the most part, Leo the Deacon's history ends when Basil's reign begins. So there is frustration. It's frustrating trying to find the real Basil. You're absolutely right. And that does, add to the debate in a way, because that uncertainty means to some extent one can or one has to construct Basil.
Yes, indeed. And especially the Psellos depiction that you mentioned is very intriguing. Was it the interest in those more puzzling personal aspects of Basil's life that pushed you towards stepping outside of academic writing and making him the focus of your historical fiction novel?
Well, certainly Psellos is the one who provides us with a glimpse of a human being, which we don't get at all in Scyllizes. We really don't. And yes, he does make this interesting remark, Michael Psellos. He says that sometime in his early adulthood, there's some kind of change in Basil. Up to then, he'd been perfectly happy to live a quiet life, enjoy himself, have good fun, and let the soldiers do the fighting and let the eunuchs do the administering. And he was perfectly happy with that. But for some reason, he suddenly departs from doing that and gets serious and decides to take power, which he does. So that was a kind of hook. But to be honest with you, that wasn't really what set me writing. What set me writing was the fact that we had COVID-19. And, we were all stuck at home, and I'd done all my teaching preparation. I couldn't go on holiday or anything, couldn't go anywhere. So I thought, well, this will be my holiday. All right. So that's really where it comes. So I'm afraid it's much more mundane genesis of the novel than actually being inspired by Michael Sellas, but I did use Michael Sellas a lot. And it's a good read in its own right. I do hope people will read Michael Sellas's Life of Basil II, and indeed all his biographies of Byzantine emperors, the Chronographia.
How close then your account follows Sellas, and what is Theosis about?
Well, Theosis is really looking at Basil's personality more than anything else. I think it's another historical novelist, Bernard Cornwell. I heard an interview with him the other day, and he said every historical novel has two stories. There's the big story, the one that is in the historical record, and then there is the small story, which is the invented one, which is usually the personal details. So if you're writing a novel about Napoleon, well, he'd still fight the Battle of Austerlitz, he'd still fight the Battle of Waterloo, but then there would be his personal life, his childhood, maybe relations with his wives, that kind of thing. So I suppose in my novel, I really wanted the little story to be the big story, and the big story to be the little story. So the events we've been describing, we really it covers a period from when Basil's very small up to the time when he seizes power. And then we revisit him in his old age, about 1024. So we leave out vast chunks of what actually happened. But nevertheless, the kind of background to it is these events, Nikephoros Phokas seizing power, his murder, John Zimisces takes over, and then Basil, after his death, asserting himself. So there is the main kind of story there. But it's Basil's personality I'm really interested in, because it seems to me that only that can provide an answer to this question of why on earth does he suddenly come from nowhere and confront the generals, confront the administrators, take over completely, rule almost completely unaided for decades, pull off the victories one by one. It's only really in his personal life that we can find the roots of that. And so I suppose that's really what is much more about Basil, the human being. And I should say right here and now, a very flawed human being, as perhaps we all are.
I will have to ask, one of the big mysteries in Basil's life is, of course, his unmarried status. It is something extraordinary in medieval times for a ruler not to marry. Is this also one of the mysteries that you tackle in the novel?
Yes, indeed. You can't get away with it. You're quite right that Basil is very, very unusual in pre-modern monarchs in that he never marries, because marriage for a medieval monarch is a very important element of policy. It's a good way of making an alliance, either with people within your own realm or with foreign rulers. So to forego it in that way is very unusual. Now, I teach Basil II, and I raise this with my students and ask, well, why do you think he didn't get married? Now, almost always someone will say, oh, perhaps he was gay. Well, yes, but it's not unusual to have gay rulers in the Middle Ages. There was a king of England called Edward II, and the love of Edward's life was a man called Piers Gaveston. And nevertheless, he still married a woman called Isabella of France, and he had a son called Edward III. It's what you did. You had to produce an heir, and you had to make foreign alliances. So Edward does the necessary, but Basil doesn't do that. So that leads me to think, well, it's going to be more complex than simply saying that somebody is homosexual. Now, in the book, I do portray Basil as somebody who is attracted to members of his own sex. That seemed a more logical way to approach it. But it's also tied up with his particular circumstances. His sexuality is directly related to the very strange circumstances in which he finds himself, because he's 5 years old and he is the key to power. Whoever controls that child controls the empire. So there are really two people who are looking to control him when he's 5. One is the Emperor Nikephoros Phokas, but the other is the Chamberlain, a eunuch called Basil Lekapenos, whom Basil refers to always as Nothos. And it's really Nothos who dictates the environment in which Basil grows up. And he makes absolutely sure that Basil has contact with almost nobody. He even regularly changes the servants so that Basil can't get too close. He makes sure that he never sees any other children. In fact, he makes sure that Basil doesn't really have any contact with any person apart from himself. And it's Nothos who basically shows kindness to Basil and gives him things and looks after him. And this all comes straight out of Theosis. And as a result, Basil grows to adore Nothos. Nothos is his mentor, his friend, and he also comes to kind of admire his physique as well. So there's this sort of shadow of Nothos, who is Basil's mentor. He's a father figure. He looks after him. He's the best friend. He takes him around the palace. He gives him things. In that environment, that is how Basil gradually develops. But literally, he's like the Ottoman sultans who were kept in a cage. He's in this very gilded cage for a long time. And Nothos is successful in making sure that this boy is sequestered so that only he controls him. Well, so far, so good. But however hard you try, you're never going to sequester people completely. And a number of accidents happen. For a start, Basil is taken on a hunt and his horse bolts and he's rescued by a young man called Uranos. And for the first time, Basil finds himself alone with somebody who is not Nothos. And this is a strange experience for him. And he forms a friendship with Uranos, which is going to last for a long time. And later, Nikephoros Phokas is overthrown. New Emperor John Tzimiskis overrules Nothos and sends Basil to school with other students. So then he starts to see other people and become attracted to them. So however hard Nothos tried, he hasn't been able to sequester Basil completely. It's in that environment that Basil's sexuality develops.
Very interesting. There are, of course, countless studies, academic works on sexuality, gender, masculinity within Byzantine Empire, but only fiction writing, right, can give us those kind of details, portrayal stories. And I wanted really to ask you, you said that it was partially born out of COVID, but I think a lot of academics did write during the COVID, and not all of them finished successful fiction books. So what was your experience switching from academic writing to fiction writing like?
You know, when I thought, I'll do this, and I'll tell you what I'll do, I thought to myself, I know what I'll do. I'll just try it this morning and see how it goes. And it went terribly. It was absolutely terrible. At the end of the morning, I thought, well, this is really, really bad. So I went out for the walk, because you were supposedly allowed one walk a day. So out I go and have my walk. And then I come back and I thought, well, should I stop? Because it's so bad. And I thought, well, I'll give it another try. So I tried it in the afternoon. And it was still bad. It really was bad. And by the evening, I thought, well, this really is terrible. Maybe just delete the whole lot. And the same thing happened the next day. The next morning, I thought, this is terrible. I thought, I'll go for the walk, and that's it. But when I was having the walk, I suddenly thought, hang on. And I realized what I was doing is that I was writing history. And I needed to be more inventive. So that's when I came back, and that's when I introduced a subplot. There is a small subplot which involves the caretaker of a mosque and an Egyptian ambassador. And that's largely in there to help the reader see Basil as others see him, because most of the novel is in the first person. It's Basil himself talking. And once I brought that in, then slowly everything changed, and then the characters started to speak for themselves. And that's when Basil's character started to emerge, and the character of his mother, and the character of Nikephoros, and of Nothos. But it didn't come immediately, I must say, because, you know, you're right, it is a very different kettle of fish. And sometimes I did sound as I was giving a lecture or something. And then I moved away from history. And I think, you know, one of the things I know I'm going to be castigated by my colleagues, because there's all kinds of details in it that are probably wrong. Some are deliberately wrong. I've moved things around to make the narrative better. But some things are probably inadvertently wrong. And to be honest with you, I don't really mind, because it all it is, and all a novel is an entertainment. You know, if you want to know about Basil II, well, there's a wonderful book by Catherine Holmes called Basil II and the Governance of Empire. And that's the thing to read. And that's where you'll get the real, you know, as close as we can get to the real Basil. But what you've got in my book is simply me constructing Basil and hopefully entertaining readers along the way.
I think that Holmes' monograph can fit neatly into the period that you skipped in your book. Thank you very much, Jonathan, and congratulations on your novel, Theosis.